Hello, salam, adab, namaste to everyone, and welcome to today's lecture by Professor Ayesha Jalal. It is a really wonderful and very pleasant moment for us to host her. And today it will be rather, she's known for her historical, expediency and work and all those, but today she's touching Ghalib. And perhaps it is also part of that history that she is going to tell us through the prism of Ghalib, a much tall figure during a very turbulent time in Indian history. Welcome, Professor Ayesha Jalal, and we have invited Professor Asim Siddiqui, Professor of English Literature at Aligarh Muslim University, and he is a very well-known reviewer, author, and takes much interest in history as well. So, Professor Asim Siddiqui, please.
Thank you, Raziruddin sir. On behalf of Indian Diaspora Washington DC, I welcome Professor Ayesha Jalal to this forum. May I just very briefly introduce Professor Ayesha Jalal. She is Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University. She had her PhD from University of Cambridge, and she had also been a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. And Professor Jalal has also been an associate professor at Columbia University. He was also visiting associate professor at Harvard University. We have largely known Professor Ayesha Jalal through her books, through her wonderfully received books. And I still remember when in 1985, her book, The Soul Spokesman, was published. I was in the hostel, and in the English newspaper, there was a news report. I think it was a front page news report which talked about her thesis. It was a very talked about book. And I can talk about its influence by simply referring to many other works which either take a position, say, against her or in favor of her. In fact, any number of books after that have been published, but somehow many of those books, say, talk about her book, talk about her thesis. I can just mention two recent books. One by Venkat Dhulapala, another recent book by Ishtiaq Ahmed. So this is the influence of her scholarship. And of course, there have been a number of other books also, The Struggle for Pakistan, then Partisan of Allah, Self and Sovereignty, Individual and Community in South Asian Islam since 1850, Democracy and Authoritarianism in South Asia, a comparative and historical perspective, the state of martial rule, the origin of Pakistan's political economy and another very book that is actually my favorite as a student of literature. This is The Party. And I found its narrative extremely gripping. In fact, I have read this book many times. And I can read this book again and again. Of course, she has also been a great editor. She has also been a great columnist. And she has also worked with Professor Sugata Bose, another very important historian, on a book, Modern South Asia, History, Culture and Economy. Incidentally, Professor Sugata Bose's book, His Majesty's Opponent, is one of my favorite biographies of all Indian political figures. She has been, say, so her works are there, they are discussed, they are talked about, and we learn many things from her writings. We learn not only history, we also learn how to write, we also learn how to say, talk about history in a very good manner, say, keeping a kind of balance between good history and good prose style. As far as this particular topic is concerned, and the topic, we know that the topic is being Muslim, Ghalib's Poetic Illuminations. Now, this is a very interesting topic, and I'll be very eager to not only listen to her talk, but also to read her book, if there is any book, say possibly, on this particular subject. Now, Ghalib, we know that has been one of the most influential figures. And if we talk about the entire, in the entire subcontinent, especially probably 19th century is the century of Ghalib because we can put Ghalib at par with all major 19th century poets. And of course, Ghalib's greatness has been acknowledged widely. We can remember one very interesting sentence by Abdul Rahman Bijno Ghalib. The scholarship on Ghalib has also been immense, of course. I mean, number of editors, famous editors, right from, say, Imtiaz Arshi to Kaldas Mirza and many others. And of course, there are some very important issues in Ghalib scholarship. One important issue is, say, the history of different texts of Ghalib, say how we establish the textual history of Ghalib. And recently, Meher Afshar has talked about this particular subject very well. And of course, Ghalib's Persian connection, and of course, Ghalib's place in Sabke Hindi tradition, that is a very important tradition. And of course, the view whether Ghalib was an inspired genius or rather Ghalib revised his works. So that is a lot actually. There is a lot about Ghalib. And if I talk about Ghalib's work as a student of literature, his letters, of course, they can be a very rich resource for historians. But as far as his poetry is concerned, because he is put in a manner or his style is sometimes his style is not exactly a meaning. Song many of Ghalib's couplets were considered, say, meaningless. But then, say, other editors, other say interpreters, they found some interesting meaning in Ghalib's couplets. When we think about Ghalib, was Shia or Sunni? In fact, I mean, this again is can be a matter of conjecture as far as his beliefs are concerned. He always he described himself literally as half Muslim, somebody who does not eat pork, but somebody who drinks wine. And if we think about some famous couplets of Ghalib, say for example, uh, हम वाहिद हैं हमारा केश है तुर्क रसूम मिलते जब मिट गए जाइमा हो गई और न था कुछ तो खुदा था कुछ ना होता तो खुदा होते so we see that Ghalib has this very say, metaphysical view of religion, sometimes kind of view which say rises above narrow considerations. And some interpreters have also talked about some Buddhist influences in Ghalib's poetry. I can think about one particular book by Professor Gopichand Narang. So here there are lots of issues, and Ghalib, say his relationship to the making of textbooks and how he looked at modernity which was emerging at his time. So there are lots of issues about Ghalib which probably are still very relevant and where say a historian like Ayesha Jalal can possibly say a lot. I have just one or two more queries in my mind, and these are not queries addressed to anyone in particular. But here I'm thinking about Ghalib as a student of literature. But we know that literary sources or, say, for example, works of literature are also read by historians. And sometimes the methods that historians bring to a particular work, they can be very different from the method that, say, students of literature possibly adopt. Just one or two issues. Say, for example, for students of literature, the meaning of a work is never exhausted by the intention of the writer. So, for example, if Ghalib had a particular intention, students of literature would rather sometimes ignore that intention because intention can never be recovered. So, that is one important thing. That's of a work and the intention of a work. Significance, say somebody like E.D. Hirsch, a very important phenomenological critic. Say, for example, intention when something was produced, but significance when we look at that work in later periods. So, because intention can never be recovered, so that's why it remains a problem. But for historians, intention is of paramount importance. Maybe for a student of literature, intention may not be as important. Similarly, there is another view that students of literature can bring to a text, and that view is that the present meaning of a word, present meaning, say for example, I'm talking about 21st century, the present meaning of a word may not be important for historians, but they may be important for philosophers, or they may be important for literary literary historian. So, for example, if and another important thing is that students of literature, they often consider, say, text non-practical, non-purposive, non-referential, but this is certainly not the view of historians. So here, these are important issues, but of course, in literary interpretations, also the role of history has been very important, right? From uh, the last century when we had that traditional historical school, and recently when we have a number of critics coming from new historicist school. Of course, their view of history is more nuanced. But still, at the end of the day, historians and literary, say, scholars, they sometimes can use very different methods. And that's why we can have different Ghalibs in the works of, say, literary interpreters and in the work of historians. And I'm very sure that when we talk about Ghalib's religion, when we talk about Ghalib's humanism and some other related issues, Professor Ayesha Jalal, with her vast experience, with her vast say, knowledge, will bring something entirely new. And I'm very sure that her work will prove extremely influential like her other works. I again welcome Professor Ayesha Jalal to this forum. And now uh, Professor Ayesha Jalal will address you. Thank you, Professor Ayesha Jalal.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Asim Siddiqui, for this very generous and um, very sort of contextualized introduction. Ghalib is a major literary figure. People have claims on him. I have no claims on him, but I'm a historian and I have my questions. So I'm not trying to present, I mean, I think it's a matter of interpretation. Historical interpretations are very different from literary interpretations. And this is not a work of literature. It's a work of history that looks at an important figure with a particular view, which is to understand the transformations in the idea of religion in the aftermath of the 1857 rebellion. So that's basically what I'm doing. And Ghalib is my prism, as Raziuddin Saab understood from the very outset. So it's not an exhaustive, by any means, topic. Much more to be said. I'm only providing you a bird's eye view of what is going to be a book, but not on Ghalib. Ghalib is just a very small part of it. But that is what I'm working on, my forthcoming book. So this is drawn from that, and that too, a very small sliver of that work. As I said, it's an interpretive work, and it has a certain goal. I really want to just begin by talking about the aftermath of 1857, the dramatic reconfiguration of Delhi's spatial counters after its recapture by the British in September of 1858 posed grave challenges for those at the receiving end of the new dispensation. Colonial officials generally blamed Muslims for the uprising. The trial and banishment of the aged Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, to Rangoon only served to turn that suspicion into an established fact. There was some consolation for wise and discerning Muslims. The passing of the Mughal age was neither sudden nor surprising. Since losing its moorings in the 18th century, the empire had survived more as an emblem of legitimacy than a power capable of enforcing its will. Even without Jamshed's proverbial cup reflecting the entire world in a flash, it was easy to foresee time like a potter's spinning wheel, reshaping the city's topography to meet the emerging demands of new political fortunes. This did not solve the problems of an oppressive present, but expectations of being released from existential miseries in the future were an incentive for a defeated people to strive and persevere. Far from clinging unthinkingly to a lost past on account of the rigidities and impositions of a repressive and retrograde religion, Muslims in India did a considerable amount of thinking, debating, and writing on how to cope with the present in order to fashion a more meaningful future for themselves and posterity. The flexibility and, in many instances, openness shown by many Muslims to the altered circumstances of the post-Mughal era was not an exclusive preserve of English-educated elites. The sheer volume of Urdu publications from this period that engaged and absorbed Western ideas suggests a reading public which, even if relatively small by European standards, was by no means exclusively an English-speaking one. The establishment of Fort William College in 1800 had given a spurt to Urdu. Translation societies proliferated during the first half of the 19th century, with Delhi College emerging as a hub of the intermingling of Western and Eastern cultures. Mathematics and sciences were taught in Urdu. By 1846, Delhi College had a list of 128 books translated from English into Urdu. A catalogue of Urdu books at the India Office Library, prepared in 1900, was 300 pages long. The books were authored by Muslims and Hindus who were engaged with the new learning and wrote on a wide range of diverse subjects related to agriculture, education, ethics, geography, history, medicine, law, logic, philosophy, and theology. The period stretching from the late 19th to the early 20th century was an especially productive one and happens to be the focus of my work, coinciding as it did with the Muslim Reformation spearheaded by Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his Aligarh movement. The unsubstantiated assumption that the majority of India's Muslims were insular because they were wedded to religious strictures may well have been one of the more mischievous inventions of the colonial era that, remarkably enough, has persisted into the post-colonial periods, despite ample evidence to the contrary. The misleading confusion between what being a Muslim means and what a Muslim is expected to be is a perennial issue. While it can be debated conceptually to a certain point, the complexity of the issue is best entangled through recourse to history and literature. In recent times, there's been a lot of debate about the important intellectual contribution of the late Shahab Ahmed in what is Islam, which is provocative and well argued. However, there's a need, I believe, to go beyond the purely conceptual, which is what Shahab's work is, to the concretely historical, to illustrate how Muslims actually live and have lived their lives in different historical periods, rather than how they are expected to. So in today's lecture, I will examine the implications of the 1857 rupture for religion in particular, variously understood and lived amidst the difference leveling assumptions of the colonial state backed by decennial censuses and an officious bureaucracy. I do so by foregrounding the concept of enlightened Muslim intellectuals, variously referred to in Urdu as Roshan Khayal, or alternatively as Azad Khayal, independent-minded, Wusad Damal, or Wasiul Nazar, broad-minded, to ascertain how they negotiated the new political landscape of Delhi, in which they were stigmatized as disloyal and rebellious on account of their religious beliefs. Within this intellectual milieu, I am focusing, as you know, on the poet Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib to tease out enlightened thinking of a towering figure seen to be located on the dangerous border between Muslimness and infidelity. A dervish at heart and a prince temperamentally, Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib had lived in the Mughal imperial city for almost half a century. His insights and personal experiences offer rare glimpses into life in Delhi after May 11, 1857, when the rebels took control of the city, and late September 1858, when it was taken back by the British. He had started writing his Poetic Illuminations from an early age. Replete with philosophical and mystical strains, Ghalib's Urdu poetry is more popular than his Persian verses, which reflects the shift from Persian to Urdu, a process that originated in the 18th century but gathered momentum under colonial auspices. Scenes of Mashairas, poetic recitations at Bahadur Shah's court, and the exchanges between the poets, real and imagined, are part of popular memory in South Asia to this day. So while relishing the opportunity of being on the royal payroll, Ghalib tended to be sorry not to have realized the full potential of his God-given instinct for freedom. In a letter to a friend, he admits to lacking the physical strength to fasten a tin water pot around a walking stick and take off on foot, arriving one day in Shiraz, taking up residence in Egypt the next, and then landing up occasionally in Najf. In a veiled allusion to the famous prophetic hadith, seek knowledge even if you go as far as China, Ghalib regretted not having the means to host a learned scholar. He thought it befitting that he should not go hungry and unclothed in his own city. This was a reasonable enough expectation from an old and infirm fakir like himself, who was facing such adversity that though he could not bear to see anyone begging, he was being forced to beg from place to place. In the opening verses of his Ode to Delhi, Ghalib slams the arrogance and vengefulness of the British martial law administration, especially the indiscriminate singling out of Muslims. Today, every English soldier is an autocrat, going from house to the bazaar. The human heart fails. What is called the public square is a slaughterhouse. My house is like a prison, while every bit of Delhi's dust is athirst for Muslim blood. Locating himself in his home, locking himself really in his home in Old Delhi, Ghalib wrote a moving and personalized account in Persian of events in Delhi from May 11th, 1857 to July 31st, 1858, which was published as Dastanbu, literally a bouquet of flowers. The book is neither a full autobiography of Ghalib nor a complete story of 1857. His purpose in writing the book, at least in its published form, quite simply seems to be to persuade the British to restore his suspended pension. The obsequiousness towards the British in this book is sharply juxtaposed with the anguish and pain Ghalib felt at the plight of dear friends and associates who, because they sided with the rebels, were in jail or had perished at the gallows. His close friend, Maulana Fazl-e-Haq Khairabadi, was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Andaman Islands, while Mufti Saduddin Azarda was charged with treason, but eventually released. Ghalib was leading a comfortable enough life in Delhi to resent the uprising. Delhi College, established in 1825, was the site of a remarkable mingling of Eastern and Western knowledge that has been variously described as a renaissance, a flickering light that dazzled brightly and then died suddenly, or rather was killed by the violence and hatred of the 1857 uprising. A study of Ghalib's personal faith of the sort I am undertaking today is not a theme typically associated with someone infamous for calling himself half a Muslim on repeated occasions. But this is precisely what makes him such an interesting point of departure for an inquiry into the vast and difficult question of what being Muslim feels like, especially at key historic ruptures. For Ghalib, the rebellion was a disaster, as it put a stop to his only two sources of income, a salary from the Mughal court and a pension from the colonial administration in recognition of his family's aristocratic status. So it is hardly surprising that the well-heeled Ghalib thought the rebellion was a senseless act instigated by unthinking and lowly men for short-sighted gains. Significantly enough, Ghalib charged the rebels with sedition against the Mughal emperor, not the British, which was technically correct, but at a stretch from the truth. He regretted the indifference of the times and the tragic ruin of a city he had made home for decades. So many of his close friends and associates, Hindu and Muslim, had perished in the carnage that he feared there would be no one left to mourn at his funeral. Delhi had been ravaged. Hardened laborers were lording it over in the city, sleeping in silken beds in the fort, while moon-faced Mughal princesses were walking about the city streets in torn, dirty clothes and worn-out shoes. Every corner of the garden had become the graveyard of spring, Ghalib lamented. He was no less critical of the reign of terror initiated by the British. Decrying the destruction of Delhi, he notes that the general massacre of the inhabitants was ordered, and a Muslim had become another word for a rebel. The religious landscape of the city was being redesigned to the severe detriment of Muslims. There was talk of demolishing the Jamia Masjid, converting the Fatehpur Mosque into a military barrack, and turning the Zinatul Masjid into a bakery. Allah, Allah, minarets of mosques are being torn down, Ghalib wrote to a friend, while flags adorning the entrances of Hindu homes are fluttering. Entire bazaars had disappeared, neighborhoods had been razed, leaving no trace whatsoever. Every day a new law is issued here. I just don't know what all goes on here. Taxes had been imposed on almost everything except grain. This city is not a city, he protested. It is a desert. The light has gone out of Hindustan's government, Ghalib wrote on hearing of the death of the last Mughal emperor, who had been his patron and disciple, Bahadur Shah, who wrote under the pen name of Zafar. Hundreds of thousands had died, while those alive did not have the ability to live. Nobody was rich in Delhi except some Hindu traders. There was not a single wealthy Muslim in the city. The familiar hustle bustle had been replaced by a desolate wasteland from the Jamia Masjid to Rajghat Gate. Entire bazaars were demolished to broaden city streets or to punish those who had sided with the rebels. The newly established British military administration ruled with draconian powers from the Delhi port. Most egregiously, the Jamia Masjid was occupied as a punitive measure after the stiff resistance put up by the Friday prayer congregation, which successfully thwarted the first British attempt at taking over the mosque. Officers and soldiers climbed up the minarets, drank beer and brandy as they danced in the sacred precincts to celebrate victory, with scant regard for Muslim religious sentiments. While the mosque was eventually returned to the Muslims in 1862, the extended occupation of the central site of Islam in India by soldiers loyal to the British Crown symbolized the end of an era and the uncertainties of an unknown one under non-Muslim rule. The wheel of fortune had taken a catastrophic turn, leaving Muslims of all classes and ages reeling under the weight of a difficult present and a bleak and uncertain future. The British occupation of Jamia Masjid proved traumatic for Delhi Muslims, highlighting the loss of self and sovereignty. In the words of one despondent Muslim resident, Namazis weep on seeing it every morning, washing away their faces with tears. They are consumed by sorrow over this, eating neither in the day nor sleeping at night. Ghalib was not much of a mosque-going enthusiast, as most of you know, but would have empathized with these feelings. He does, however, note that within days of the Jamia Masjid's release from the British, kebab sellers had set up shops on the mosque stairs. Other sources provide a fuller meaning of the mosque's significance in the lives of Delhi's Muslims. One of the key witness accounts compiled by Khwaja Hasan Nizami describes the visit of Bahadur Shah's brother, Mirza Salim, to the Jamia Masjid in the month of Ramzan before the rebellion. The prince who had received a dressing down from his mother for listening to music during Ramzan in defiance of the abstinence and piety decreed for Muslims is pleasantly surprised to find a vibrant scene at the mosque. People were sitting together in groups, some reading the Quran, others discussing some religious matter. Two men debated issues of Islamic fiqh or jurisprudence, with scores listening on. Some prayed while others remained engrossed in focused sessions. A battery of faithful was sprawled across all four corners of the mosque. As is customary in the holy month of Ramzan, the aristocracy and rich denizens of Delhi had sent food wrapped in wonderfully colorful silken fabrics, edged with shiny decorative laces, each one more beautiful than the other. This was in keeping with the spirit of competition that accompanied the desire to gain virtue and social status with offerings of food. Since it was time to break the fast, there was a loud din, and the Jamia Masjid's courtyard looked like a brightly rolled out carpet covered with innumerable homemade delicacies for those waiting for the call to prayer to break their fast. After the rebellion, Mirza Salim's nephew, Mirza Shahzor, visited the Jamia Masjid in Ramzan to find fireplaces burning everywhere and soldiers making chapatis while their horses were being fed. There were mounds of grass everywhere, and Shah Jahan's beautiful mosque looked like a stable. A few years later, during Ramzan, Mirza Shahzor returned to the mosque, which had by then been released by the British, to find a handful of Muslims wearing dirty patched clothing. A few were reading the Quran, and the rest were reciting prayers of various kinds. When the time came to break the fast, a few men distributed dates and a dried lentil mix to the small crowd. There was none of the former grandeur and commotion. Shahzor regretted that now, when Muslims were cornered into subjugation from all sides, the English-educated strata was seldom seen at the mosque. The poor were hardly capable of restoring the mosque's past glory, but it was a divine mercy that it was still there. He feared, however, that this may change if Muslims continue to slide economically as they were doing at the time. Ghalib echoed the prince's lament. There was a city by the name of Delhi once, but had ceased to exist. The city's life revolved around the fort, Chandni Chowk, daily prayer congregations at their Jamia Masjid, weekly walks to Jamna Bridge, and annual fairs like the flower growers' walk to the Qutb in Mehrauli. When none of the five existed anymore, how could there be a Delhi? The city emerging under British dispensation lacked old Delhi's refined culture, sweetness of diction, and its multiple charms and endearment. Ghalib could not find a single person to appreciate his talents, even though he counted several Englishmen among his students and admirers. He longed for the evenings at Bahadur Shah's court, when he and an array of talented poets joined together to enlighten the gathering with their sharp-witted and mutually competitive compositions. None of that refinement and mild-mannered etiquette remained. It is said that Delhi is a big city and all kinds of people live here, Ghalib wrote, but it is now no longer that Delhi. It is a military camp. Allah, Allah, the people of Delhi still praise the sweetness of their language. But where is Urdu? Where is Delhi? Oh God, there is no city here, but a cantonment. There is no fort, no city, no bazaar, no river. Foreigners had replaced the city's inhabitants who had either fled or been hanged. Houses formerly inhabited by Mughal nobles and scholars of repute were now occupied by illustrious Englishmen for whom the entire city was being redesigned. Delhi's refined Urdu was being submerged in alien dialects. None of the former charms of the city persisted. The atmosphere was politically toxic for Muslims who were under suspicion by colonial officials for harboring rebel loyalties. Targets of rough and ready justice, Muslims who had fled the city to escape getting caught in the crossfire between the rebels and the company's army, were debarred from entering Delhi after its recapture for 2 years and had to purchase tickets of unspecified amounts to enter the city long after Hindus were allowed to return to their residences. If colonial policies bred resentment and alienation, they also elicited an openness to Western ideas among educated Muslims, not all of whom can be dismissed like Sayyid Ahmad Khan was by a vocal section of those who claim to be bastions of patriarchal Islam as mere imitators and sycophants of the colonial masters. Ghalib takes pride of place in the legion of Muslims, men and women, who showed a breadth of vision and open-mindedness. There were many more like him who were willing not just engage with Western ideas, quote unquote Western ideas. I say that because there's no such thing as Western and Eastern and in purely bound categories. There's a lot of mutuality and interflow of ideas. There were many more like him who were willing to engage with the new ideas and practices, but also closer to home with members of other religious communities. They included, among others, the literary luminaries, Maulvi Muhammad Zakaullah and Nazir Ahmad, as well as the mastermind of the Aligarh reformist movement, Sayyid Ahmad Khan himself. All practicing Muslims, they, along with Ghalib, who flaunted his lack of religiosity, did not consider Islam to be a barrier to social and intellectual entanglements with members of other religious communities. The supposition was externally imposed and became evident only after the significance and meaning of religion was transformed under the auspices of a British Raj professing a philosophy of liberalism that was undercut by the policy of promoting colonial difference. The 1857 uprising was different from past ruptures and devastations, not because of the end of a dynasty. It was the passing away of an entire cultural way of life, of being and interacting, a historically acknowledged transformation, but rarely ever exposed from the analytical perspective of personal faith. Religion as personal faith was not only one of the main casualties of the rebellion's aftermath, but has remained at the margins of analysis ever since. There is a need to reverse the trend, allowing for a closer exploration of personal faith than has been permissible in an age of nationalism. The dialectic of personal faith and the religious category, when placed under the scanner, reveals tensions and fluidities not easily available in narratives of community and nation. What did the loss of Mughal sovereignty mean for someone like Ghalib? Never known for outward displays of religiosity, he was nonetheless troubled by the plight of his co-religionists. Ghalib grew up to understand the differences between the illusion and reality of Mughal sovereignty, which did not extend beyond the precincts of the fort after Lord Lake's conquest of Delhi in 1803. But the illusion of sovereignty persisted until the British re-established control in the city in late September of 1858. The symbolic connotations of the rebel army's defeat after a ferocious battle, and then the bruising trial and painful exile of the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah, who was still loved, if not feared and obeyed by his subjects, have outlived the temporal specificity of 1857 in subcontinental imaginations. The rebellion's failure did not trouble someone of Ghalib's ilk, but a quiet sullenness was in evidence in much of northern India, even a decade or more later. Trust between the two communities was one of the first victims of 1857. At Bahadur Shah's trial, Muslims and Hindus blamed each other in a frantic attempt to escape the colonial noose. This poisoned the atmosphere and was deadlier for coming so soon after the end of Mughal rule, in which both communities had worked together and enjoyed substantial stakes. The colonial policy of seeing Muslims, regardless of their internal differences and divisions, as the principal instigators of the rebellion only made matters worse. Being a Muslim carried the connotation of someone who was not just a rebel, but a defeated and disgraced one. It is unbecoming of the free-spirited, Ghalib wrote in the Sambu, to hide the truth. I am only half a Muslim, he confessed, and free of the rigidities of religion and community, and was afraid of neither slander nor disrepute. He drank French wines every night and could not sleep without it. He despised the rebels for their pettiness and bigotry, and was in turn considered a worthless deviant, if not an outright infidel, by those of an orthodox bent. Much like Robert Musil's hero in Man Without Qualities, and for those of you who haven't read this marvelous and incomplete novel, I really recommend it to you, Robert Musil's hero in Man Without Qualities, who had all the qualities in the world that society failed to recognize. Ghalib was half a Muslim, not due to any deficiency in his faith in God, but because that is how social standards of the time judged him. So as he blithely remarked to Pandit Motilal, the Mir Munshi of the Punjab Lieutenant Governor, I would be an infidel if I didn't drink alcohol every single day of my life, and a sinner if I prayed even once. I just don't understand how the government has included me among the Muslim rebels, unquote. Ghalib had put his finger on a key tension that would haunt relations between Muslims and the colonial government. Identifying Muslims as rebels might have made sense from a military point of view, but ran the risk of alienating an entire community, however suspect and prone to rebellious outbreaks. The policy was later revised under the viceroyalty of Governor General Mayo, but the basic contradiction remained: a distrust of Muslims because of the mistaken and historically questionable belief that Islam inclined its followers to wage jihad to establish supremacy in the world. This colonial policy played as much, if not more, of a part in fanning the antipathy of madrasa-educated Muslims, unable, like before, to secure government employment. The hardening of the categories Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim and Hindu in the post-1858 era was directly related to heightening tensions between religious communities over jobs, representation, and power sharing, communities whose outer boundaries in the past had often been more porous than their internal ones. Ghalib's biographer, Altaf Hussain Hali, portrays him as an ethically expansive, free-spirited, and lively personality whose real religion was Sulai Kul, Akbar's Sulai Kul, mutual respect and peace for all. He had been brought up by a deeply religious mother who taught him to show respect towards all religions. While growing up in Agra, Ghalib had several Hindu friends with whom he later recalled playing chess until midnight and flying kites. Described as an intelligent, sociable young man with a cheerful, romantic bent of mind by a contemporary, Ghalib was also known for his quick-wittedness and humor. He followed the Quranic dictum, to you your faith and to me mine, and kept a diverse company of friends who, along with his students, belonged to different religious communities and came from all over the subcontinent, open-minded towards other religions and their practices. He was above sectarian animosities. This is underlined in several of his verses and letters, some of whom Professor Siddiqui cited. As he once professed, we believe in the unity of God. Our religion is renunciation and of convention. Sects, when they disappear, become part of the faith. After Delhi had been emptied of Muslims following the rebel defeat, Ghalib was left in the company of Hindu friends. He acknowledges his special debt to Mahesh Das, that friend of God and river of generosity who sustained him with a constant flow of Indian wine that was similar in color to the French, but had a superior bouquet, and without which he would have died of consuming thirst. His correspondence with other friends and disciples like Munshi Hargopal Tafta and Munshi Shiv Narayan Aram similarly reveals closeness and affection. Can Ghalib's social broad-mindedness and willful transgression of the prohibition on drinking alcohol be squared with his personal faith? If Islam is more than a set of religious injunctions with exclusively literalist meanings, then the answer has to be in the affirmative. A firm believer in the unity of being, Tawheed-e-Wujudi, and emotionally devoted to the Prophet and his family, especially Ali, whom he held in high esteem, Ghalib's personal faith finds reflection in his poetry and prose, often in a half-serious or light-hearted manner. His stated belief that everything happened in the world because of God made him a determinist. But like other Muslim thinkers before and after him, he did not deny the importance of human free will and faith in God. He was capable of discerning the difference between literal and metaphorical meanings and had no difficulty reconciling faith with reason. हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत, लेकिन दिल के खुश रखने को गालिब यही ख्याल अच्छा है. We know the reality of paradise, but Ghalib, it's a good idea to keep the heart. It's a good idea to keep the heart happy. He professed his revulsion at the very thought of paradise, where he would be restricted forever to the one hoary celestial virgin. Elsewhere, he playfully asked God to place a bit of paradise in hell so that the atmosphere there would be more varied and the walks more interesting. Without the joy of daily walks with his friends and the delight of their company, he saw no worth in the free-flowing heavenly wine promised to believers. A Maulvi once asked Ghalib that the prayers of wine, a Maulvi rather told Ghalib that the prayers of wine drinkers were not heard. Why should one need to pray if wine is available, he quipped. He was not one to get bogged down in controversies over theological matters such as predetermination versus human will that has distracted generations of Muslims from more pressing issues of their present and future. Ghalib preferred to steer clear of public controversy, but the publication of his book Qata-e-Burhan, A Critique of Quran-e-Qata by Muhammad Hussain Dekani stirred up a hornet's nest. A barrage of letters arrived each day condemning his un-Islamic lifestyle and exhorting him to abstain from drinking alcohol and perform his daily prayers. Some were simply abusive, hinting at the possible mixture of jealousy in the guise of religiosity. Once when he was in Delhi, Hali visited Ghalib, unaware of the abusive letters that were pouring in and day out. Deeply attached to his mentor, but also a product of social conditioning that considered Ghalib's transgressions beyond redemption, Hali professes feeling sad at the thought of having to part company with Ghalib forever after death once they encountered Rizwan, the angel guarding the gateway to heaven. Hali's presumptuousness about going to heaven aside, he was prompted to broach the subject of prayer suddenly with Ghalib. In his own words, it was an egregious mistake and one for which he was forever ashamed. Mustering up the courage and with due respect, Hali tried exhorting Ghalib to say his prayers, but by then Ghalib had become hard of hearing. Hali circumvented the oral limitation with a letter outlining why it was imperative for Ghalib to say his prayers regularly. There was no need to perform ablutions each time, but missing one of the 5 pairs was not an option. Ghalib thoroughly disliked Hali's didactic epistle, especially since it sounded a lot like the daily harangues he was receiving about his violations of the Sharia from strangers, some of whom peppered their righteousness with lowly abuses. Ghalib's response to Hali merits being quoted at length. I've always lived a sinful life. I never prayed nor fasted, nor did any good deed. Now in these final years of my life, if I started praying, whether seated or through signs, would my sins be washed away? What I deserve is that when I die, my loved ones and friends should blacken my face, tie a rope around my leg, and drag me through the city streets and alleyways, and then throw me outside the gates for dogs, eagles, and crows to eat, if they would care to eat something like that. Although my sins are such that I deserve worse treatment than this, but there is no doubt that I am a believer in the unity of God. At all times in solitude and silence, these words are constantly on my lips. There is no God but God. Nothing exists but God. God alone is manifest in all things. Ghalib has much to say about the merits of wine in his literary corpus, but like so many poets in the Indo-Persian tradition, he did so in keeping with the Sufi tradition. Intoxication for Sufis is a metaphor for the ecstasy of divine revelation. Ghalib expressed his chagrin at being addicted to wine. He drank regularly, but not excessively. His guilt at not abiding by a religious precept is in itself an indication of his being a believer, since an infringement without knowledge or in error is not considered a sin in Islam. Ghalib was of the view that everything that happens in the world is because of God, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. This did not lead him to conclude that exertions of everyday life were unnecessary, since God takes care of everything. Ghalib's paradoxical persona, a nonconformist who was also a believer, is not easy to square. The non-serious manner in which he often discusses matters to do with religion makes it difficult to gauge the difference between his real attitude and what he's saying in jest. This can result in serious disagreement about his lack of religiosity. Sheikh Abdul Qadir, editor of the Lahore-based newspaper Observer and the famous literary journal Makhzan, thought Ghalib exaggerated his indifference towards religion, and his statements on the subject are not to be taken too seriously or literally, Qadir thought. They were, quote, really passing phases of thought, and very often as he did offer prayers and did observe the fast. Qadr then proceeds to cite Ghalib's letter to his friend and disciple, Mir Mehdi Majrooh, dated April 16th, 1861, as evidence for his view. Quote, have you forgotten my usual habits? Have I ever missed the Taraweeh prayer at night in the Jamia Masjid during the month of Ramadan? How could I have stayed at Rampur during this month when Nawab was insisting that I should stay? He tempted me with the prospect of the mango crop in the coming rain season, but I managed to get away so as to reach Delhi for Chand Raat, the night the Eid moon is sighted. Since the first day of the month, I have been going every day to the mosque of Hamad Ali Khan to hear Maulvi Jafar Ali recite the Quran. At night, I go to the Jamia Masjid for Taraweeh prayers, and when I feel like it, I go to the Mehtab Bagh to break my fast and drink cold water. Aha, what a good life. Since regularity of religious observances, Qadr proceeds, would put even a pious mullah to shame. He's so impressed with this letter of Ghalib. What he does not mention is that Ghalib follows these lines that he quotes with a statement, now listen to the actual situation, suggesting that he was being humorous, or alternatively just engaging in a bit of literary adornment and showing off his verbal eloquence. An equally plausible conclusion is that Qadr, who published his thoughts on Ghalib in 1947, had internalized colonial understandings of religion as a category, as a bureaucratically determined category, instead of reading it as a playful reference by Ghalib about his lack of outward religiosity. Qadr interpreted the lines as a simple assertion of religious identity, stripped of the humor. There's very little in Ghalib's vast corpus of writings to corroborate Qadr's view of him as a practicing Muslim, even if only during the month of Ramadan. Once after the month had passed, Bahadur Shah asked Ghalib how many fasts he had kept, to which he responded, not one, my master. On another occasion, a Maulvi came to see him in the afternoon during Ramzan and was taken aback to hear Ghalib asking his personal attendant for water. Are you not fasting? Asked the surprised Maulvi. I am a Sunni, Ghalib shot back. I break the fast 2 hours before sunset. This did not mean that Ghalib was any less of a believer, as he himself was prone to wistfully assert. जिंदगी अपनी जब इस मुश्किल से गुजरी Ghalib, हम भी क्या याद करेंगे खुदा रखते थे. When life passes so miserably, Ghalib, how can we remember possessing a God? But it must have been a deeply introspective moment that inspired him to compose these much quoted lines. Iman mujhe roke hai jo khinche hai mujhe kufr, Kaaba mere piche hai kalesa mere aage. Faith holds me back while infidelity attracts me. Behind me stands the Kaaba, ahead of me beckons the church. He asserts his free-spiritedness in religious matters while affirming an adherence to monotheism. Independent and proud in religious devotion, I returned on finding the Kaaba's door closed. The strict monotheist was too free-spirited to wait for the door of the Kaaba to open or ask anyone to open it for him. Another verse at the end of a ghazal finds him in an impish mood about his lack of religious credentials. Those maxims of mysticism and then your sublime oration, Ghalib, we would consider you a spiritual mentor if you weren't a wine drinker. Ghalib's fluctuating sense of religiosity was as much a feature of his love for wordplay as an expression of the fluidity of his identity, whether he was calling himself half a Muslim, staking a claim as a spiritual guide for would-be Sufis, or implying oneness with God. Early on in life, he had no prescribed hours of drinking and had an insatiable appetite for mangoes, wine, women, and gambling. Once he was appointed at the Mughal court, Ghalib reformed his lifestyle. He now drank only after the call to prayer at sunset, mostly alone or in the company of a few close friends. After drinking, Ghalib vowed never to commit the sin again. At the same time, he always implored God to ease his punishment as he drank, not for lustful and depraved reasons, but to attain selflessness, to somehow ease the intense pain he felt. A limit is needed for a judicious punishment, he wrote. After all, I am a Muslim and not an infidel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was really very engaging lecture. We learned another aspects or many other hidden aspects of Ghalib and that time. And I think now it is time for us to go for question answer. But before that, Faisal, could you just take a moment to show the audience coming weeks. Hello, Faisal?
You have it.
Before we go to question and answer, I just want to show to the audience what is for next coming Saturday. We have a lecture by Professor De La Duza and Dr. Latika Gupta. Basically, it is Latika Gupta who has done a lot of work on Muslim girls in India, their education and how they are coping with many other issues. So it will be a series of lectures coming on Saturdays on Muslim girls' education in India. So, okay,